Miyu Sayori is, and has been for the majority of her life, verbally and physically abused by her stepmother, her half-sister, and her father. Though born into a prominent family in 19th century Japan, she's treated worse than a servant of the house, often with malicious intent, as her family seems to only derive joy from seeing her as miserable as possible. Though My Happy Marriage borrows tropes from other Cinderella-esque stories and takes place in a world where magic exists, there's no whimsy in Mio's life. Instead, there's a kind of mundane maliciousness to Mio's abuse that feels very real. Her stepmother throwing away her real mother's gifts to her, her family locking her away in the shed for hours, telling her every day how worthless she is, how they wait for the day she will simply die and they will be done with her. And the only person in the world that seems to make Miyu the least bit happy, a boy named Koji, is now being married off to her half-sister, another act of cruelty, as he's way too afraid of his own father to do anything to help her. Miyu is, well and truly, alone, and you feel for her, because she doesn't deserve it, but she does believe wholeheartedly that she does. In this world where magical abilities are real, where she should have power and love, she has nothing. She has no skills, no power, no magic, and she believes she doesn't deserve a life. That lie, repeated to her over and over and over again for years, is all she knows. She'd be better off dead. In one last act of cruelty, Miyu's family decides to marry her off to Kudo Kayoka, who's rumored to abandon his wives in the street and possibly do much, much worse than her parents ever could. And Miyu truly believes that this is it. Any last semblance of even the smallest bit of comfort in her life is gone. She leaves her home the next day by herself with the clothes on her back and a few measly belongings. She walks and rides all the way over to Kudo's home and finds there a rather plain house and a rather kind older servant named Yuri and Kudo Kiyoka, who frankly doesn't care. He's cold and he's harsh to her. He makes a list of cruel rules she must follow, almost certainly aimed at making her uncomfortable. But the sad thing is, none of them are any worse than what her family does to her. So she agrees to all of them, without batting an eye, and her complacency catches Kudo off guard. Things move slowly from here. Though we know where these tropes lead, Kudo and Miyu don't. Kudo is, once again, cruel to Miyu. He rejects the breakfast she makes for him, saying she must have poisoned it, and that he doesn't trust her. Which, to be fair, his position as a high-ranking noble and a commander of a military group that fights the monsters of this world, that's not an insane assumption. But the prying of Yuri, who, let's face it, is a heavy shipper, he apologizes to Miyu and asks her to cook for him again, and it's delicious. He praises Miyu, who begins to shed tears at what's likely the first compliment she's been given in over a decade. And here, right here, is where the real conversation about My Happy Marriage begins, because Kudo starts putting two and two together. A girl from a prominent family moves to his house with next to nothing, has almost no public background, behaves like a servant, is way too thin for her age, doesn't bat an eye at his cruel demands, has calloused hands, and cries at the first bit of praise she receives. And so here we have a main character who's a victim of abuse, and a love interest who is at the very least suspicious that that might be the case. And this is incredibly dangerous territory for any story to go, so I'm rather surprised to report that My Happy Marriage walks a rather mature line, and this is what I think makes the show so popular. Yuri and Kudo don't immediately ask Miyu anything. Once they suspect something's wrong, there's a switch that flips in Kudo. Never again will you see him say a cruel thing to Miyu. From this point forward, he treats her like a person. He invites her on a date. They are to be married, after all, which she hesitates to accept, fearing that she'll bother him. In fact, at first, she doesn't even assume that he's asking her out. But he tells her plainly, calmly, you won't be a bother. You don't need a reason to go. Throughout the date, he addresses her concerns and compromises without making big speeches or overwhelming her with praise or love bombing her or ordering her in any way. Kudo does what he can to make her feel safe, wanted, an equal. The date is short from our perspective, but it's a productive one. Mio is nervous but happy and doesn't want the day to end. And Kudo is a bit out of his element here, especially when buying her clothes and flirting ever so slightly. But they do their best, as awkward as they are, and it all accumulates to a single moment. After the date is over, Kudo leaves the equivalent of a marriage proposal outside Mio's room after they get home. The gift is a hairbrush, brand new and beautiful, to replace the one that had once been shattered by her stepmother, the whittled down comb that originally her mother had once given her. That old comb, a sign of her mother's love, is also a sign of Mio's inability to move on, to find happiness in anything other than the distant memories of her mother. This new comb, given to her by her fiancé, the tsundere he is the first gift she's received in years. It's an affirmation that perhaps she is still loved. And there, right there, is why Kudo is perfect for Mio. Because the happiest we've seen him, the moment his eyes light up, is when he sees that Mio is happy. And that's where I first believed that this will in fact be a happy marriage. Now there's more too, and another story, another layer of why Kudo is more than just a pretty face. Kudo, being in the military, sends someone to investigate Mio's past and her home life. Kudo essentially learns it all: the abuse, the lack of love, the circumstances around Mio's birth, and how, though she has no magic, her mother belonged to a bloodline with a particularly coveted ability. And his first comment after hearing all of this is that he bets buying her a new kimono is not nearly enough to heal the wounds of her heart. And he's not wrong. Mio is not simply a rag doll to which viewers can project their own love towards, and Kudo is not simply a self-insert. Mio is deeply traumatized. I'm no medical professional, but I would say she probably has some form of severe PTSD. She suffers from nightmares. When she talks, she's constantly anticipating people yelling at her. Her younger sister terrifies her, and not just a joke kind of terrified. I mean, Mio physically and mentally shuts down after her sister finds her alone in the market. She can't move, she can't speak, except for constantly saying sorry, despite doing absolutely nothing. She has to be led away by Yuri, and when she's finally home and safe, she falls into a depression. All of this is the result of having no one to love her throughout her entire young adult life. Her mother died when she was very young. Her father never loved her mother anyway, and without powers, there's no way he would pay attention to her at all. The only maid to ever stand up for Mio, trying to save her from the shed, was promptly fired, and she never saw her again. Koji does love Mio, but he's too afraid to stand up for himself, let alone her. Mio begins this whole arc deeply unwell. Once Kudo grasps her situation, he and Yuri immediately become a support system for her. When Mio is concerned about her looks, Yuri doesn't reject her worries, but instead helps her put on makeup and praises her looks. Whoever did the translation for Netflix did a superb job, because every time Kudo speaks to Mio, whenever she's worried, whenever there's a chance that that trauma will resurface, his words are always chosen very perfectly. He doesn't simply say, "You aren't a bother." He means that if anyone were to think anything so absurd, any confrontation would be his problem, not hers. When she asks for his permission to stay with him after confessing, he doesn't just say, "Yes, you can." He tells her that he's the one who wanted her to be there. Nobody but him, not her parents, not the arranged marriage. She is wanted, and he is lucky that she would even ask him. There is a healing kindness in the relationship. There is no condescension. Kudo does not treat Mio like a child, but rather a person who deserves a lifetime of love that she never got. But he will do his best to make up for it. and this will slowly allow Mio to heal. She cooks. She does work, no longer out of fear of her family, but because she wants to be acknowledged by Kudo. She wants to do a good job. She becomes more comfortable with physical touch. She begins to openly express her opinions. She goes from needing to be convinced to leave the house to asking to do so. Though all the while, she still can't convince herself that she deserves it all, because she's still afraid of her family, of disappointing Kudo, because she thinks that when he finds out she doesn't have powers, he'll abandon her. But there's a turning point in this story after her sister re-traumatizes her, and Mio stays away in her room, and Yuri and Kudo think of ways to help her out of her depression, and Yuri tells Kudo that expressing how much he cares for her will be able to help Mio. And I was waiting, and I was worrying that this was going to turn into some cheap poem or card or present that will supposedly heal Mio and everything will be swept under the rug. So imagine my surprise when, instead of that, Hannah, the maid who stood up for Mio all those years ago, the one who she hasn't seen since, one of the few people in a previous life who ever cared for her, comes through her door. Kudo did what only Kudo could do and used military intelligence to create a reunion that is 1,000 times better than any gift he could have gotten her. Hannah and Mio talk, and Hannah is doing well. She survived the trauma of that house that they both came from, and she is allowed to live happily. A life that Mio can now see, she's allowed to live too. She's not alone. And she understands now the extent of what Kudo does know. And yet, she still confesses it all to him, and gives him her gift, and puts back up her walls one last time, fearing retribution, still maintaining that last bit of distance between them, until he closes that distance and gives her the warmest hug. He wants her to be there, and he wants her to want to be there too. And she does. And then when things are actually looking really good for the couple, Mio's even hosting dinner parties. I mean, for like 3 people, but that's honestly a huge step for her. After all of that, her family can't let her be, or rather, her parents, her sister, not her family. These are not her family, because they try to rip her away from Kudo. Because her sister hates that she's happier than her. Koji's father hates that Kudo's family has someone who could potentially produce stronger offspring. So they kidnap her. They string her back up in that shed that they threw her into as a child, and they beat her, and they threaten her to call off her marriage, and they gaslight her again, blaming her for existing. They try to take all the credit for her happiness because the one time their plan to make her life miserable fails, their plan specifically to ship her off to a man who they think will abuse her worse than them, ends in her being happy. They try to take that away from her, try to claim that this was their doing, that she should give it up and thank them. But it's too late. They made a mistake. They locked her in a black box for all those years and claimed that's all she deserved. But because her father is literally a malicious idiot, he let her out. And she saw the world outside, and she's never going back. She doesn't give in. She refuses. She speaks back to these people who seem very much like they want to kill her. She rejects them, and not just because she feels like she owes Kudo, she rejects them because she wants to be with Kudo. Because being his fiancé is the first time in her life she can choose to be something that she loves, and she would rather die than give that up. Luckily, there are consequences to kidnapping the fiancé of the strongest magic user, and for once in his life, Kujo grows a spine, and not only attacks his father for messing with Miyu, but also goes to Kudo and specifically asks for his help, because he knows he can't save Miyu alone. Though a coward, Koji is no incel. He loves Miyu, but he understands that he's not what she needs. She needs her fiancé. And there's several spots of this event that are really interesting to see. How in trying to stop Kudo from saving Miyu, Mio's and Koji's dads inadvertently burned down their whole house. How Mio's mom is more mortified at the destruction of the house than the abuse she gave her own daughter. How Mio's sister sees absolutely nothing wrong with choking her to death in front of Kudo. Shocked not at the fact that she was caught, but at the fact that he would even care. And how Koji still brings Mio's sister to safety as the property burns down because he recognizes that Mio would still be devastated if her family got hurt on her account, even after everything that's happened, even though it's all completely their fault. Despite it all, there's still a happy ending to this arc. Mio does make a recovery, though you can still see the choking marks around her neck. Yuri cries tears of joy and sorrow for everything that she's been through. Kudo is there when she wakes up by her side, stopping her when she starts to blame herself because it's not her fault. None of it was. She's not to blame at all. And there's a realization behind her eyes, perhaps a momentary affirmation that she understands now that this was not her fault, that she can be happy, that she deserves to be happy, and that she is loved. I know there are more episodes to My Happy Marriage that are coming out after the script is done, but I think this 6-episode arc, as well as the one that comes close after, is a great micro story of love and healing. I do have some complaints and some hopes. I hope that going forward, Miu can find other relationships outside of Kudo, a larger support system so that she can rely on more than just one person. I also hope that she can have other aspirations outside of just being his wife, other things that can bring her happiness. For criticisms, I do think the magic and monsters in this world are a bit underdeveloped, and I think the circumstances of Miu's kidnapping does hinge on quite a few coincidences. It's a bit contrived, but as a whole, it's easy to see why this show is doing so consistently well, with people loving Kudo and loving Miu, and loving their dynamic. Because their relationship is not only wholesome, but it's understated in the best ways. It moves quickly, but I believe because of how genuine Kudo is and how real Miu's trauma is, that it's not about best boy or best girl or those rankings. It's about wanting them to find happiness together. And I think that's the hallmark of a great romance. Hey! Thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked it, if you don't mind, maybe leaving a like or even a comment. That really helps with the algorithm, and it'll help my video get to 500 views, maybe, I hope. We'll see. If you like that video and perhaps other stuff that I have, then consider subscribing. Expect more anime and potentially more other funny videos coming your way on here, this little channel of mine. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye!